Hi, I'm Frank Hammer, and welcome to theAnalysis.news. In just a few seconds, I'll be back with Eric Blanc, and we're going to talk about the role of labor and federal workers, in particular, in defeating the Trump and Musk coup. Don't forget the donate button, and I'll be back in just a second. Joining me now is Eric Blanc. He is a professor of labor studies at Rutgers University. He writes the Labor Politics newsletter on Substack. His latest book is We Are the Union, How Workers to Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big. So Eric, with that, I welcome you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And this is a wonderful occasion. We're the day after Mayday. And maybe we might want to start off with that. Were you able to observe any of the Mayday events around the country? Were you possibly a participant in one?
Yeah, I was at the Mayday protest in New York City, and yeah, it was big. It was livelier than the last few years, and I think it speaks to the obvious crisis we're in the U.S. Where working people are facing just this authoritarian billionaire takeover, and I think the reason you're seeing so many workers in the streets is a reflection of the crisis we're in.
And did you see any change in the makeup of the Mayday? Not only was it larger, but did you see greater participation by the labor movement, by the labor unions, or?
Yeah, there was certainly more union participation. The unfortunate tradition in the US is that Labor Day obviously got taken away from us and it got moved to late in the summer. And so May Day, until recently, oftentimes just frankly wasn't celebrated by unions. And it was either just the left would, do it, or more recently, immigrant rights groups have sort of revived May Day to their credit. And I think that we saw more unions this year speaking to this sort of increased urgency of resistance.
Yeah, and here in Detroit, we had our May Day event.
Hundreds of protesters hitting the streets on this International Workers' Day, May Day, taking a stand against the Trump administration.
And I was able to draw on Sean Fain's at the end of his negotiations with the Big Three, establishing the expiration date of the contracts on April 30th in 2028. And he began to speak about organizing for a general strike and highlighting May Day.
We're in the middle of two massive transformations. One is in our economic system, where the rules of global trade are being upended and with huge implications for workers everywhere. And the other major transformation is in our political system, where fundamental rights are being eroded with huge implications for workers everywhere.
Do you think that they may influence more unions to take up his call and maybe begin to establish May Day as the actual workers' celebration of solidarity?
Yeah, I think, part of the reason why we saw more involvement on May Day specifically comes out of the call, as you suggest, of Sean Fain and the UAW for a general strike on around May Day in 2028. And then the Chicago Teachers Union and other sort of progressive unions have taken up that fight to, say if we're going to be able to get in the direction of something as ambitious as a general strike in 2028, we need to start organizing now. And so there was a big push by the CTU and allied left-leaning unions to start mobilizing on this May Day. And yeah, so I think that it's an important day to reclaim. It's an important sort of benchmark to see how much capacity we have. And I think, frankly, we can't wait till 2028. So I'm glad that there was mobilization this May Day. But I still think that, the crucial question is, what are we doing over the next 4 months and not just over the next 4 years?
Indeed. And of course, Fain made that remark before Trump was elected. So I think the urgency escalated shortly after. So you had written in a previous Guardian article that it's hard to exaggerate the stakes by standing up in large numbers to defend federal workers and their services. We can isolate and eventually defeat Musk and Trump. If we don't, we could be living with the consequences for a long, long time to come. What does that look like to you? And how can you sort of pull that apart and explain how you perceive that?
Yeah, the federal workers, as Chris Doles, who's a leader of the Federal Unionist Network, put it, are the canaries, the canary in the coal mine.
They're really not after efficiency. The attacks on probationary employees is making it much, much harder for all of us who remain.
And can I just make a clarification on probationary? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers, and they can be people who work under 2 years, but they can also be someone who worked for 30 years, was promoted.
That's right.
Right?
What the government is trying to do to the federal workers is what they're going to do to the rest of us as working people and other unions if we let them get away with it. And so, yes, in that sense, it's really hard to exaggerate the stakes. The reason they had to go after the federal workers first is because Trump understands that he needs the sort of completely compliant government apparatus at his whim. And an obstacle, the main obstacle to that are federal workers unions, right? Because they're going to push back against illegal reactionary impositions from above, just like they did in 2016, 2017, 2018. So he has to break these unions. He has to intimidate workers. He has to force out people who are, seen as troublemakers in order to be able to pass and push through the rest of his agenda. So there's both the stakes of not letting him have this sort of authoritarian control over the government. That's why it's important. But it's also because if they're able to break these unions, that's going to send a clear signal to the rest of the employer class that they can do the same across all of the economy. Just like we saw with the PATCO strike in 1981, when Reagan fired, again, federal workers. These were federal air traffic controllers. Even though that was a public sector workforce, the rest of the employer class said, oh, turns out the government's not going to enforce labor law. Great. We can go after all unions. We can go after all workers. We can do what we want now. And I think that people are looking to see at Musk's playbook, where you force half of the workforce out, keep everybody else having work double for, even though they're working far more and they're terrorized and intimidated to speak up. Most employers, frankly, would want to do that if they could get away with it. And so I think that bosses are looking to see how much pushback there is in the federal government, both legally and in terms of resistance from below. And I think that working people in turn are also going to look to see if people resist, is that going to win? If people try to fight back, is that going to be a more plausible way to survive than keeping your head down? Because frankly, a lot of times people's inclination is to keep their heads down. So the stakes as far as resistance against authoritarianism, against a billion-dollar takeover, are high, both from the employer class and for working people from below.
So I have to say that here in Detroit, we've had a series of demonstrations over this past 3-4 weeks. The postal workers, the letter carriers, and the postal worker unions both had demonstrations here in downtown Detroit. We had the AFG Local 933 that demonstrated at the VA hospital, where a number of them had already been fired. Of course, the postal workers are very concerned about privatization, and it seems to me that these kind of actions are going on around the country. What role are and in the case of the AFG, we had a vice president of the union here during that demonstration. What kind of role do you see the leadership of the national unions, and particularly the AFL-CIO, in promoting this bottoms-up resistance to what Musk and Trump have in mind for the unions?
I mean, I think it's really good that locally in Detroit and some other places, there's been local union presidents who have helped organize protests. But I think the big problem we have is that the overarching strategy of most unions has been very focused just on the legal side. And this is tricky because the legal battles are important, and we've seen real wins as far as slowing down. We don't know what the ultimate outcome is, but as far as slowing down these illegal attacks and mass layoffs and agency closures, the legal piece is clearly important. So I don't want to minimize that, but it's not sufficient if you're going to actually defeat the attacks, because ultimately, the Supreme Court's going to rule on a lot of these, and I don't think we should have much confidence in the Supreme Court doing the right thing. And then B, you need to have a level of public backlash to stop these cuts, because some of them are legal. They are. Some of these things they can do are reactionary, but they can lay off people. They have mechanisms to lay off people legally, and we need to stop those as well. And then we need to make Trump and Doge and Musk pay a real political price for the reactionary agenda they're imposing. And so that's both a question of, legal, but it's overwhelmingly a question of mass public backlash, right? Where, Trump is sensitive to public opinion. He's doing his best to ignore it, but the reality is that Congress and a lot of these Republicans, they're getting nervous because Trump is plummeting in popularity. And if they keep on imposing these cuts, and it becomes clear that to all of the Republicans in office that siding with just the mass destruction of Social Security, Medicaid, all of these basic infrastructure services that we've assumed, taken for granted, if Republicans across the board see that this is going to be like a death sentence for their political careers to be associated with this, then it's going to be at that point where you're going to see real fissures up top in the administration. Currently, right now, all of these Republican cowards are still going along with Trump because either they agree with ideologically or they're scared to go up against Trump at all. So you need to defeat that and to put real pressure to actually stop these cuts from happening. You need a wide level of public backlash. You need, hundreds of thousands of people in the street. You need mass civil disobedience. You need it to be the headline story that people are resisting this destruction of the services that we've depended on for decades. And you can't do that just through lawsuits. You need the unions to go all in on organizing and mobilizing their membership. And currently, that's not the approach that most unions are doing. Most unions, at best, are doing very scattershot, small-scale actions. They're not really focused on getting their members into action. And that's really what we're going to need to see to win big.
We saw on April 5th a massive display of public power, or public pressure, I should say. I think the estimate was that there were, 2 to 5 million people in the streets across the U.S. And it seems to me that we should be welcoming that kind of outpouring of anger and frustration. And how can we make that something that's good for, looking for the long haul? And how can the unions connect with that spirit and bring unity between the rank and file members and the people that were out in the streets protesting against Trump and Musk? What do we need to take?
It's a good question. April 5th, I think, shows that it's in many ways the tip of the iceberg. It shows that there's a real desire to fight back amongst Americans. And what you saw is millions and millions of people take to the streets on April 5th, despite the fact that really the biggest organizations we have of working people did not really seriously mobilize their membership for April 5th. You had unions at the very last minute send out emails nationally, but didn't do the type of concerted organizing and mobilizing that can bring out really large numbers of workers. So, it was good that there's 5 million people in the streets. There's 14 million union members, right? So if you're able to bring out even half of the union movement, you would double these protests, and you would frankly bring in not just numbers, but you'd bring people with real disruptive capacity. Workers across the economy have disruptive capacity because if they don't go into work, those institutions won't function. And when you get large numbers of labor unionists into motion, it poses that threat because unions have the disruptive capacity. They also have the resources. It's not just sort of isolated individuals. And so the union movement, I think, hopefully needs to look at April 5th and say, we're falling short of what we need to be doing. And I hope that sort of fight back militant spirit seeps in more to the leadership of the labor movement. And so that the next time that there's a big, united day of action, that it's not just a last minute email telling people, how hope to see you out there, but you really build up to it for weeks in which you're building structures, you're building contingents, and you use it as an organizing opportunity so that you're talking with your coworkers, in which people are getting organized at their workplaces. They're going together after work. They're getting buttons. They're doing the real kind of like campaign fight back that you do sometimes. For instance, the labor unions love doing this when there's an election. Like they know how to get into mobilizing mode when there's an election, for a Senate campaign or something like this, or the president. But for some reason, they've yet to be able to get into that campaigning mode when it comes to saving American democracy and our public services.
One of the interesting things is that when we saw one of the first assaults in the last few decades, when Reagan went after the PATCO air traffic controllers, and fired 11,000 of them. And they, of course, PATCO had supported Reagan.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike. This was the culmination of 7 months of negotiations between the Federal Aviation Administration and the union.
I think there's very few in the labor movement today that remember that in that fall, we had 500,000 union people demonstrating in Washington, D.C. And it seems to me that that needs to be resurrected to refresh the memories of the labor movement and the labor leadership, that there was a fight back, even though it was a devastating blow by Reagan. Certainly no comparison to what's happening now. What can we do to get the labor movement to resurrect that mobilization for a mass gathering, for example, in Washington, D.C.?
I mean, I think a mass gathering of labor in D.C. would be a really important first step. There's some openings for this already. I believe that veterans are going to be mobilizing on June 5th, maybe it's June 6th. I have to look at that. And so one of the major federal workers unions base is in the VA. And so this is a big opportunity to show up in support of veterans and against cuts to the VA. Just more generally, having a day of action which labor goes all in would be a really useful way to concentrate energies. But I would flag that just having a one-off action is not going to be enough. And this was actually a limitation in 1981, as you mentioned. I believe it was Solidarity Day, where everyone comes out. The problem is if that's not linked to a campaign, if there's not a next step, if there's not an escalation, well, then just one day of action is not going to be enough. And so it needs to be sort of part of a movement and not a substitute for a movement. So I think that's the question, is what is the escalating campaign that labor can do? So it's, mass actions across the country in DC, but also in other big cities, but with a real plan for escalation. If they don't, if they keep on moving it like they're moving as far as the authoritarian austerity, cutting Social Security, mass cuts to Medicaid, well, what are you going to do as labor? Protests might not be enough. You might have to start doing sit-ins at the different agencies. You might have to get community members to start disrupting, Republican offices, disrupting business as usual. You might have to have workers talk about work slowdowns or stoppages. If it's not part of that type of campaign, I don't think the Republicans and Trump are going to back down.
One of the things that has recently, of course, gripped the labor movement is the question of the Trump tariffs. And so, for example, there's folks on a lot of different sides of this question. Just in the last couple of weeks, we had the Unifor, the auto workers, and specifically I'm talking about the tariffs in the auto industry, being an auto worker myself, that demonstrated on the Windsor side of the river in Canada against the tariffs. And we had a rally on the Detroit side at Hart Plaza in downtown Detroit in support of the Canadians, broadly speaking, and also in regards to specifically the tariffs. International solidarity is going to be a very key component, it seems to me, in the struggles going forward. How do we bridge this? How do we navigate so that the labor movement maintains its unity with foreign workers who are being affected by the tariffs as well? How do we do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's not a question with a very simple, easy answer. Because on the one hand, it seems to me clear that the free trade agenda of the last 4 decades has been a disaster for working people and for manufacturing workers in particular. And so in that context, I think it's reasonable for the UAW to support targeted tariffs to make it harder for companies to move abroad. And I think that would make it easier to unionize because one of the major obstacles we have in unionizing the South, where you have all of these non-union companies, is that the threat and fear of capital flight is very high. Every time you try to unionize one of these big plants, there's always the management always says, okay, well, we're going to move to Mexico if you try to unionize. If you're able to undercut that threat, it is going to go a long ways towards unionizing across the board in manufacturing in the US. So I think that's a reasonable thing. On the other hand, it's also the case that, working people, we're an international class. There's no interests. We don't want to pit ourselves as workers in the US against the interests of Mexican or Canadian workers. And in fact, we need to understand that our struggles are deeply entwined, because even with tariffs, the supply chain is still going to be international, and we're only as strong as all of us are. And so we need to find ways, I think, really concretely, to be supporting the unionization of workers in Mexico to drive up the floor there as well. And there's so much promise, in part because the Mexican government is very progressive and has passed a lot of important labor law reform. I think there's a real opportunity for the UAW and other unions to see that one of the crucial ways that they can prevent capital flight to Mexico in particular is by going all in on supporting Mexican workers to unionize, because that's going to raise wages there, and it's going to make it harder for companies to want to go elsewhere. If they feel like no matter where they go, there's going to be a union, well, that's another important mechanism to combat capital flight. And the big agreement, UMSCA, on sort of trade between Canada, US, and Mexico is, I believe, coming up for renegotiation next year. And I think this is where it's really important that there be a real fight from the UAW to set international standards, to set a wage floor across the board, minimum wage. These are the types of things that, if it combines those internationalist fights with tariffs, I think that it's going to go a long way towards overcoming the disunity on the specifics of the tariffs right now.
So one of the impacts recently of the Trump and Musk, and specifically Doge cuts, had an impact, and this is generally not in the media, that hit the National Endowment for Democracy. And the National Endowment for Democracy has, one of its 4 institutes has been the Solidarity Center, connected with the AFL-CIO. And I know, just talking recently with representatives that are in Mexico, that 39 of the 40 staff people that were there to support Mexican workers, not so much forming unions, but forming independent unions, that it was completely, shelled by these cuts. And this is actually impacting the AFL-CIO operations around the world. And I wonder what it's going to require for the labor movement to replace that, and to be able to do the kinds of things you said in supporting Mexican workers, for example, in elevating their wages and working conditions, and maintaining connections with, obviously, with other countries. How do we navigate that? That, to me, is a huge question that maybe labor hasn't even begun to grapple with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the short answer is labor should be using some of its very deep pockets in the US to be supporting this type of work in a way that it's going to have to fill in the gaps to a certain extent of the Trump cuts. And labor does have the money. So, if you take the labor movement as a whole, there's over $30 billion in assets that the labor movement is sitting on. It's not that there's no money. There's plenty of money. It's a question of priorities and of really understanding that the way we win is by organizing workers and not just waiting for politicians. And frankly, if we're looking beyond the US, we have an amazing opportunity in Mexico. Again, this is like as progressive a government, as pro-union government as you can expect in Mexico. And there's a real opportunity for Mexican workers to build strong independent unions. But unfortunately, it's going to require a good amount of support, I think, for that. And yeah, so there's an urgency towards putting money to fill this gap that the Trump administration has imposed.
So to come back to the federal workers, which I think you were specifically writing about. So they've been stripped of their union, and I don't know that regular folks understand what the implications of that is, and whether or how they, these are the TSA workers, how they recoup and reestablish their collective bargaining rights in their union, especially with, in the meantime, the blows struck against the NLRB and so on. So how does labor navigate that in support of the federal workers who've been stripped of their union by Trump and Musk?
The good news is that some of the lawsuits have put a temporary block on some of the executive order taking away collective bargaining rights. But again, we don't know how this is gonna end up going, and I think there's a real chance that a lot of workers lose their union rights unless there's a huge amount of backlash. And frankly, it's been sort of disheartening to see that the labor movement hasn't gone into overdrive mode in response to this unprecedented attack. Taking away union rights for 1 million workers, one would expect that this would, result in something more from the labor movement than just another round of telling people to call their Congress people. It is really the type of do or die attack that needs to be responded to through mass protests, through mass resistance, and through making the cost really high, not just on the Republicans, but frankly on the Democrats to raise this to be a central political issue. It's not that there hasn't been any press on the tax on union rights and the tax on federal services. There's some, but it gets lost easily. Trump's doing a lot of different things. And I think that it's incumbent on the labor movement to raise this as a central battle right now for that, and it's a winning battle because unions, frankly, are extremely popular in the US, including amongst Republican voters. And it's a really great wedge issue in this sense to say Trump says he's pro-worker and he's destroying livelihoods of 1 million workers, setting the stage for union busting across the economy. This is a real winning issue to mobilize people around and not just to sort of tell in a very sort of half-hearted way your members to call Congress again. So yeah, it brings up what you said before is that the labor movement as a whole needs to understand the stakes of the federal workers' fight back for itself. This is an existential question. And so unless the labor movement is willing to go all in on getting all union members to take to the streets, it's not just federal workers who are impacted. It's going to be all union members who are impacted if Trump is able to get away with this.
So are there examples, because obviously the labor struggle is going on around the world. I mean, I know that not too long ago, Greek workers went out on a general strike. There are massive examples, whether it be from France, maybe Brazil. Are there examples, especially where workers are fighting against fascist emergence of governments like in Mali in Argentina? Are there examples that we can draw from where there is more advanced development of the labor movements that we can draw from and that can be publicized and popularized among U.S. workers? Are there examples that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe the best recent examples is in South Korea, where the prime minister essentially tried to organize an authoritarian coup and was defeated in large part because of a general strike that forced him to retreat. And now I believe he's gotten deposed from power. And so, yeah, so you can see the power of the labor movement when it decides to use it and decides to go all in on fighting back. And I think more generally, you can look at certain countries and see where labor unions are strong and where they're out there fighting and really maintain their roots. It's much harder for the right wing to grab hold. So you can look at like Northern Italy, for instance. Northern Italy, where the union movement remains strong, is the one part of Italy where the right wing hasn't really been able to grab hold. Similarly in Spain, where the left has been in power for many years now. That's in part because the labor movement has filled the space that people like MAGA and these crazy right-wing people have filled elsewhere. So there's a direct connection between the strength of the labor movement and the sort of political vacuum that right-wingers are able to fill at a moment of crisis. And so if the labor movement doesn't step up and say, yeah, look, the problem are these billionaires and these companies, well, then it's easy for right-wingers to come in and say, we hear your pain. It's because of the immigrants, it's because of the trans kids, whatever. And so, it's not enough just for labor unions to support anti-fascist candidates. They need to actually grow and they need to assert themselves to impose a different political vision on society.
So talking about visions, and I think that maybe this will be the last question I'll ask you because I know you got to go. So one of the big controversies, certainly within my union, has been the whole question of U.S. involvement in wars abroad, and specifically, certainly Ukraine. And also one of the outcries at the Mayday rally here in Detroit yesterday was about ending U.S. support for weapons to Israel. And the UAW has taken some good positions, calling for the ceasefire, calling for the ends of weapons being sent to Israel. What's your take on that, and how key is that in the overall mobilization of labor to get on the same page regarding wars overseas and Palestine specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, on a moral level and also on a strategic level. On a moral level, it's important just because there's a genocide going on, and frankly, we need to do everything possible to stop that, just for basic human rights reasons. And I think that the strategic question and the harder piece is how to get that understanding to feel urgent for large numbers of American workers. Because if it's just the current sort of activists and lefties who already agree, well, then we're not going to be able to win. And I actually think that the polling and all of this stuff shows that people are overwhelmingly are moving in our direction. Sentiment against Israel and what their war crimes is increasing. But it's not necessarily like the most salient issue in people's minds for your average American worker. And so this is a real difficulty because there are American workers who have a huge amount of leverage potentially to stop this genocide. So whether you think about the workers at the docks who end up shipping the these war materials, or if you think about manufacturing workers who might be building them and then getting shipped, these workers have a huge amount of potential power. But it's not enough just to like pass resolutions and to say, the UAW should do this or the unions should do this, because to do something as potentially risky as like an illegal work stoppage to stop the distribution of materials to a genocidal regime, you need to have a high amount of worker buy-in, right? And so you need to start by meeting workers where they're at, which will in large part, I think, be by saying, why is it that we're funding by the billions wars abroad when we working people in the United States are struggling to survive? This is a way of, I think, talking to people without even having to go into all of the somewhat complicated details about Ukraine and Palestine. You obviously go into it if they are interested, but they're just on a really basic level. I think workers don't believe and are correct that their tax money should be going towards paying to kill people in other countries. And so getting that sort of program of education around money for schools and healthcare and infrastructure in the US instead of war, I think would be a really important step. And if you start able to move in that direction, then at that point, you'll be able to start talking in a more realistic way about the types of disruptive actions that workers in the US could do. But we're not there yet. And so I do think that it's incumbent on us to have like a more broad-based anti-war movement. We should have millions of people in the streets right now by all working people saying, cut off money for the Israeli regime, money for schools and healthcare, not for war. And I think if we're able to get unions to move on that would be a first step towards the more sort of disruptive actions that obviously we'd all like to see.
I'm actually going to ask you one more question. As soon as Trump got into office, he pulled the U.S. back out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and this is an existential threat for all of us. And I think the labor movement perhaps has been slow to respond, but we need the unions in the forefront of the struggle on behalf of workers and on behalf of the planet, of course. Have you seen any indications that the labor movement is moving in that direction, or are there ideas that you yourself have had about what needs to happen?
I think the sad reality is that the climate struggle has taken a real step backwards. It's not only that we're not moving forward quickly enough, but in part because of Trump, we're just on the defense when, to prevent him from just getting the EPA and getting basic environmental protections, to say nothing of moving on the offensive to take the necessary steps towards decarbonizing our economy. So I think the sad reality is right now we're on the defensive against Trump. The best thing, frankly, we could do in the short term to help stave off climate catastrophe would be to defeat Trump, because at this moment, that is going to be the most urgent. That's the biggest threat towards climate worldwide. But then the question becomes, okay, if we're able to defeat Trump, electorally in 2026, 2028, how is it that the labor movement and the climate movement is going to be able to impose upon the government to take a real action towards a Green New Deal. Because what we saw last time is, well, Biden, in part because of the pressure of movements, did take steps in the right direction, and I think we can applaud that. But it still was insufficient, and the urgency is no less strong than it was. And I think that the piece that needs to be foregrounded is the Green New Deal as a way to improve people's living standards too, not just as, it's not just for climate in the future and for, lowering the degrees of warming, but it's because we need to provide jobs for everybody. And one of the best ways of doing that is by having huge infrastructure projects to build up, clean cities, new green infrastructure. This is a way of, I think, of talking about it towards people where they feel like their stakes in the short term are very clear. They understand how this is going to improve their lives. And I think if we're able to talk about it in that way, then getting whatever new administration we get after Trump to move as far and as fast as we need to go, it's going to be easier for the labor movement to do that. But frankly, the labor movement right now has not really articulated a clear political vision on much. It's mostly really just deferential to whatever Democrats happen to get the nomination. And so I do think it raises just this broader question of the labor movement articulating its own political vision, mobilizing its membership, acting independently, running labor candidates, supporting anti-corporate labor insurgencies within the Democratic Party. That type of more fight back political spirit is urgently necessary on climate or on any of these other issues.
So that's a great way to end, because that gives a little bit of a vision going forward of what we need to do. And there's huge tasks, of course, but excuse me, thank you so very much. We got it together. We did the interview, and I'm very happy to talk to you. Thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news. Don't forget, there's a donate button at the bottom on the right-hand corner of your screen. Thank you so very much, Professor Blanc.
Great. Thanks for having me.